The silver locket. When Emily Thompson turned 8, her mother, Catherine, gifted her a silver locket. It was a delicate piece, etched with intricate swirls and flowers, with a tiny clasp that only nimble fingers could open. Inside, there was room for 2 small photos, but they hadn't put any in yet. Instead, Catherine promised they would one day find just the right images to keep close to Emily's heart. From that moment on, Emily wore the locket daily as if it were a part of her. Life in their quiet little town was simple, filled with laughter and the smell of fresh baked bread that wafted from the bakery down the street. Emily was a bright, spirited child with sparkling green eyes and an infectious laugh that made everyone smile. She had a deep attachment to her locket, often clutching it during moments of joy or fear, and Catherine loved seeing how much it meant to her daughter. But then, tragedy struck. It was a brisk autumn afternoon when Emily collapsed in the schoolyard. Despite the paramedics' best efforts, she was gone before anyone could even comprehend what was happening. A sudden, rare heart condition, they said, one that had never been detected. Catherine's world shattered that day. The vibrant energy that filled their home was replaced by unbearable silence. Her once warm home now felt like a tomb, and everything she touched reminded her of Emily. The silver locket, always hanging from Emily's neck, was the hardest to look at. When it came time to bury Emily, Catherine knew the locket had to go with her. It had been Emily's most cherished possession. On the day of the funeral, Catherine placed the locket in Emily's cold hands, folding her daughter's fingers gently around it. It felt right. But as the casket was about to close, Catherine was overwhelmed by a sudden, inexplicable urge. With trembling fingers, she snatched the locket from Emily's hands and slipped it into her pocket. "I'll keep it safe," she whispered, almost as if convincing herself. After the funeral, Catherine placed the locket in her jewelry box, which was tucked away but never forgotten. Grief consumed her, and within weeks, Catherine's once strong frame withered. She stopped eating and stopped sleeping. The house became dark, quiet, and suffocating. She rarely left her room, only occasionally opening the jewelry box to stare at the locket, which gleamed innocently despite its darkness. One cold November night, Catherine succumbed to her sorrow. She passed away in her sleep, clutching her pillow as though it were her daughter. Her husband, Richard, was left alone, a broken man in a house that felt cursed by the past. He could no longer bear the memories, the photographs, the reminders of everything he had lost. He decided it was time for a fresh start. Richard sold almost everything: Catherine's dresses, her trinkets, and even the jewelry box that held the silver locket. He didn't notice the small locket resting inside. It was just one more item among many. He took the box to a local thrift store and the other items and never looked back. Months later, an older woman named Margaret wandered through that same thrift store, searching for a gift for her 75th birthday. She lived alone, her husband long gone, and her children were distant geographically and emotionally. As she browsed the shelves, her eyes landed on a small wooden box. Something about it called to her, so she picked it up. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. There, nestled inside, was a silver locket that looked exactly like the one she had owned as a young girl. "It's beautiful," she whispered, feeling a deep, almost inexplicable connection to the piece. Margaret's daughter, Ellen, who had brought her to the thrift store, noticed her mother's fascination. "You should get it, Mom. It's your birthday, after all." And so, the locket found a new home. Margaret wore it every day, just as Emily once had, though she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about it. She'd catch herself holding it tightly, feeling a strange weight in her chest as if the locket carried more than just memories. This feeling of connection made Margaret feel involved in a story that was yet to unfold. Not long after Margaret brought the locket home, the strange happenings began. It started subtly at first, soft, almost imperceptible noises, like the rustling of fabric or the creak of a floorboard. Then, late one night, as Margaret lay in bed, she heard it, the soft, heart-wrenching sound of a child's cry. At first, she dismissed it as a bad dream, but the crying persisted. Every night, just after midnight, the faint sobbing echoed through her tiny house, growing louder and more desperate. More than afraid, Margaret was filled with curiosity. She began speaking to the voice in the dark. "Who are you?" she whispered one night, clutching the locket tightly to her chest. There was no reply, only a child's soft sobbing. But Margaret felt a presence, a profound, sorrowful energy that filled the room. Over the next few nights, Margaret began to piece things together. The locket, she realized, was the key. Whoever this child was, she was connected to the locket and in pain. Margaret, a widow who had known her share of loss, felt an odd kinship with the spirit. She spoke to the child every night, telling her stories, comforting her as best she could, hoping to soothe whatever torment the ghost was enduring. But the crying never stopped, and Margaret's family soon noticed a change. "Mom, are you all right?" Ellen asked during one of her weekly visits. "You look tired." "I'm fine," Margaret replied, but the truth was, she wasn't sleeping. The crying, the talking, it was taking a toll on her. Ellen noticed her mother's eyes flickered toward the locket whenever they spoke, and she grew concerned. "Are you sure that locket's not bothering you?" Ellen asked one afternoon, noticing how often her mother would reach for it as though it was a lifeline. Margaret shook her head, unwilling to explain her strange connection to the ghostly child. "It's nothing. It's just a piece of jewelry." But Ellen wasn't convinced. "I think you need to take a break, maybe come stay with us for a while." Margaret refused, knowing deep down that the child needed her. She couldn't leave the house, not while the crying continued. After many sleepless weeks, Margaret finally spoke directly to the spirit one night. "You need to move on," she said softly, clutching the locket. "Whoever you are, you don't belong here anymore. You need to find peace." The crying stopped, but the presence remained. The silence that followed was thick with anticipation, as though something was about to happen. The next night, the child appeared for the first time. Margaret sat up in bed, her heart pounding as she saw the faint, glowing figure of a little girl standing at the foot of her bed. The girl looked lost, her eyes wide and sorrowful, her small hand clutching the locket now around Margaret's neck. "Who are you?" Margaret asked again, her voice barely a whisper. The girl didn't speak, but Margaret knew. This was the spirit connected to the locket, the child crying all night. Before Margaret could say anything more, another figure appeared beside the girl. This one was older and taller, an elegant woman with a pale, sorrowful face. Margaret realized instinctively that it was the girl's mother. The woman smiled softly, reaching out to take the girl's hand. "It's time to go," she whispered, her voice tender and full of love. The little girl hesitated, looking at Margaret one last time, her eyes filled with gratitude. Margaret felt a lump rise in her throat as she realized what was happening. This was goodbye. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice carrying a weight of finality. Then, together, mother and daughter turned and began walking toward a soft, glowing light that appeared in the corner of the room. Margaret watched them go, tears streaming down her face. As they stepped into the light, the room grew quiet, peaceful, like it hadn't been in months. The crying had stopped, and the sorrow lifted. The following day, when Ellen visited, she found her mother sitting by the window, the locket resting on the table beside her. "Mom?" Ellen asked, concerned by the faraway look in Margaret's eyes. Margaret smiled softly, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "They're gone, Ellen," she said quietly. "They've found peace." And with that, Margaret finally felt free. Once filled with sorrow, the silver locket was just a piece of jewelry again, a reminder of a love that transcended even death and a bond that had finally been laid to rest. If you like this story and want to hear more, remember to enjoy it and subscribe. Thanks for watching.